Picture a country where the government saved so much money it became the richest sovereign wealth fund on Earth, where the military has been quietly modernized for 15 years while the rest of Europe was cutting defense budgets, where the coastline stretches longer than the distance from New York to Los Angeles, and every single meter of it faces the Arctic. Most people think of Norway, and they picture fjords, salmon, and very expensive ski resorts. They picture a country so comfortable, so prosperous, so perfectly insulated from the chaos of the world that it barely registers on the geopolitical radar. That image is wrong. And over the last 2 years, Norway has been making sure that the people who matter in Moscow, in Washington, in Brussels understand exactly how wrong it is. Because Norway just made a series of moves that quietly rewired the strategic architecture of the entire North Atlantic. It tripled its military production commitments. It became the financial backbone of Ukraine's long war economy. It started operating submarines in waters that used to be considered safe by Russia. And it did all of this with the calm, methodical confidence of a country that has been planning for this moment for a very long time. Russia noticed, NATO noticed, and now the rest of the world is starting to catch up. To understand what Norway just did, you have to understand what Norway looked like for most of the post-Cold War era. 5.5 million people, massive oil well, a welfare state so well funded, it became a global reference point for how governments should work, and a foreign policy built almost entirely around diplomacy, mediation, peace talks, humanitarian aid, the Oslo Accords, the Nobel Peace Prize, the image of a country that preferred negotiation to confrontation. Even its military, despite being a founding NATO member since 1949, operated on a modest scale. During the 1990s and 2000s, Norway followed the same pattern as most Western nations. Defense budgets shrank, conscription was reduced, equipment aged, the Cold War was over, the thinking went, so maximum military readiness felt like an unnecessary expense. Here's what made Norway different from the others who made the same mistake. Norway kept the institutional memory. It never fully dismantled its conscription system. It never sold off the industrial base entirely. It kept training officers, running Arctic exercises, maintaining a culture inside its military of what some analysts call high North awareness, the understanding that Norway's geography places it permanently on the front line between the Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean. And when February 24th, 2022 happened, when Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, Norway didn't need to rebuild from scratch. It needed to accelerate something that was already there. Before we talk about what Norway did, we need to talk about where Norway is. Because in geopolitics, location is not just important. Sometimes, location is everything. Look at a map of the North Atlantic. On one side, you have North America. On the other, you have Europe. Now look at the gap between them. The stretch of ocean that any ship, submarine, or aircraft has to cross to move between these two continents. That corridor narrows dramatically as you move north, and right at the narrowest, most strategically critical section of that corridor sits a geographic choke point that military planners have obsessed over for decades. It's called the GIUK Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. 3 points that form an invisible defensive line across the top of the Atlantic. Norway doesn't sit on the GIUK Gap directly. It sits right behind it on the eastern side, which means Norway controls the approaches to the approaches. If Russia's northern fleet, based at Murmansk on the Kola Peninsula, wants to send submarines into the Atlantic to threaten supply lines, to position nuclear weapons, to project power, those vessels have to pass through waters where Norway has eyes, sensors, and increasingly weapons. The Kola Peninsula, where Russia concentrates a massive share of its strategic nuclear submarine force, sits directly on Norway's border. Let that sink in for a moment. Norway shares a land border with Russia, not a long one, about 196 kilometers in the far north. But it is a border, and on the Russian side of that border sits one of the most heavily militarized pieces of real estate on the planet. For most of the last 30 years, that fact was treated as a curiosity, a Cold War relic, something academics mentioned in footnotes. Today, it's the center of NATO's most urgent strategic conversation. When Russia invaded Ukraine, every NATO government faced the same question. How much are we willing to spend to prevent this from happening again? Most governments gave cautious answers, gradual increases, long-term plans, parliamentary debates that stretched months, before anything concrete emerged. Norway's answer was faster, and in some ways more radical than anyone expected from a country with a reputation for careful consensus politics. In 2024 and into 2025, Oslo announced a long-term defense plan that committed to reaching 2% of GDP, and then immediately signaled that 2% was a floor, not a ceiling. The government proposed spending increases over a 10-year period, reaching into the hundreds of billions of Norwegian kroner, infrastructure investments, new equipment programs, expanded conscription numbers, more training, more presence. But here's the detail that caught defense analysts off guard. Norway didn't just announce bigger numbers. It announced a strategic logic behind those numbers. The plan wasn't designed around defending Norway from a conventional ground invasion. It was designed around something more specific, denying Russia the ability to use the high north freely. That means submarines, surveillance aircraft, long-range precision weapons, sensors that can track movement underwater for hundreds of kilometers, a layered network of capabilities designed not to fight a land war at the border, but to control what happens in the vast stretches of Arctic Ocean that sit between Norway and the North Pole. This is a different kind of military posture, and it's one that Russia finds particularly uncomfortable because it targets the one region where Moscow has traditionally felt it had geographic advantage. If there is one domain where Norway's strategic impact becomes truly disproportionate to its size, it is underwater. Submarines are the quiet weapons that change everything. They move without being seen. They can sit for weeks beneath the surface. They force adversaries to spend enormous resources just trying to find them. And in the waters around Norway, the Norwegian Sea, the Barents Sea, the approaches to the Arctic, the geography creates extraordinary opportunities for a country that knows how to use them. Norway has operated submarines for decades, but its current fleet is aging, and the replacement program is one of the most strategically significant defense acquisitions happening anywhere in Europe right now. In 2021, Norway signed an agreement with Germany to jointly acquire new Type 2-12 CD submarines, an advanced air-independent propulsion design that can stay submerged for weeks without surfacing. Norway has ordered 4 of these vessels. Germany ordered 2. The collaboration means shared development costs, shared industrial investment, and a combined submarine capability that will operate in the exact waters where Russia's northern fleet has to pass. By the late 2020s, when these submarines become operational, Norway will have one of the most capable undersea forces in northern Europe operating in some of the world's most strategically sensitive waters. But Norway didn't wait for the new submarines to assert itself underwater. In recent years, Norwegian maritime patrol aircraft, the P-8 Poseidon, a long-range submarine hunter that can drop sonar buoys, track underwater contacts, and communicate targeting data to Allied ships, have significantly expanded their operations over the Norwegian Sea and the approaches to the GIUK Gap. These aren't just Norwegian assets. They're part of a NATO-wide effort to re-establish what Cold War planners used to call acoustic surveillance, the ability to know where Russian submarines are at all times. And Norway is one of the countries doing the most work to rebuild that capability. Russia's northern fleet is aware of this. The increased tempo of Norwegian and NATO maritime patrol flights has been noted. Russian submarines have reportedly been operating more cautiously in certain zones, which means Norway, with aircraft and future submarines, is already shaping Russian behavior without firing a single weapon. Now here's where Norway's story takes a turn that almost no other country in the world could replicate, because Norway has something that no other NATO member has. The Government Pension Fund Global, commonly known as the Norwegian Oil Fund, is the largest sovereign wealth fund on Earth. As of recent valuations, it holds assets worth over 1.7 trillion US dollars. That is not a typo, 1.7 trillion. This fund was built over decades by saving a significant portion of Norway's oil and gas revenues. Instead of spending the windfall immediately, successive Norwegian governments invested it in global stocks, bonds, and real estate. The returns compound year after year. The fund is so large that it effectively owns a small percentage of every major publicly listed company in the world. This matters for geopolitics for 2 reasons. First, it gives Norway an almost unique level of fiscal flexibility. When other European governments look at the cost of defense increases and see painful budget choices, Norway looks at the same numbers and sees something it can absorb. Second, and more immediately relevant, Norway's oil and gas industry has become a critical lifeline for European energy security. When Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe scrambled to reduce its dependence on Russian gas, one country was already positioned to help: Norway. Norwegian gas exports to Europe surged. Pipelines running under the North Sea carried volumes that helped compensate for the disruption in Russian supplies. Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, the United Kingdom all became more dependent on Norwegian energy than they had been before. This is strategic leverage of a very specific kind. Not military leverage, not the leverage of missiles and aircraft, the leverage of being the country that keeps the lights on in some of Europe's most important economies. And Oslo has been careful, very careful, about how it uses that position. Not as a tool of coercion, but as a foundation of partnership. Norway kept the gas flowing. It expanded production capacity. It invested in new fields and new pipeline infrastructure. And in doing so, it made itself irreplaceable to the very alliance it belongs to. Like Denmark, Norway has been one of Ukraine's most significant supporters relative to the size of its economy. But the Norwegian approach has its own distinctive character. Norway committed early, committed large, and committed with unusual specificity about what it was trying to achieve. The headline numbers are significant. Norway pledged multi-year military and civilian support packages worth tens of billions of Norwegian kroner. By 2025, Norway's total committed support made it one of the largest per capita contributors to Ukraine among all Western nations. But the interesting part isn't the total number. It's what Norway chose to fund and why. Norway placed particular emphasis on artillery and air defense, the two categories of equipment that Ukrainian forces identified early as their most critical shortages. Norwegian-funded packages included artillery ammunition, which sounds unglamorous, but is arguably more important than almost any other category of military aid. Modern artillery warfare consumes ammunition at staggering rates. Without a steady supply, even the most sophisticated guns fall silent. Norway also contributed to air defense systems, and in a conflict where Russia has increasingly turned to missiles and drones to strike Ukrainian cities and infrastructure, keeping air defense functional is not just a military priority, it's a humanitarian one. Beyond hardware, Norway invested in something that pays dividends over time: training. Norwegian military instructors worked alongside Ukrainian forces, transferring skills in areas where the Norwegian military has particular expertise: winter warfare, navigation in difficult terrain, small unit tactics in environments where visibility is limited, and the weather itself becomes an adversary. This is experience that Norway has built over generations, and it's exactly the kind of knowledge that can't be purchased off a shelf. Here's where Norway's story connects to something that will define global security for the next generation. The Arctic is changing. Sea ice that has existed for thousands of years is retreating. Routes that were impassable for most of human history are becoming navigable for months of each year. And beneath the seabed, energy resources that were previously too expensive to reach are becoming economically viable. For military strategists, this creates both opportunities and threats simultaneously. Russia has invested heavily in Arctic infrastructure for over a decade. New air bases on Arctic islands, upgraded radar systems along the northern coastline, missile batteries positioned to control approaches to Russian territory, a modernized icebreaker fleet, and continued development of the Northern Sea Route, the shipping lane that runs along Russia's Arctic coast, and would, if it became reliable, represent a significant new global trade corridor. Moscow sees the Arctic as a zone where Russia has historical presence, legitimate interests, and a right to assert itself. And for many years, Western nations largely deferred to that framing, treating the High North as a place where military competition was undesirable and where cooperation was still possible, even as tensions rose elsewhere. That deference is over. Norway has been the most consistent voice inside NATO, arguing that the Arctic cannot be treated as an exception to the alliance's broader deterrence posture. Oslo's position, stated with increasing directness over the past 2 years, is that the same logic that applies to the Baltic or the Black Sea applies to the Barents. If NATO doesn't maintain credible presence and capability in the High North, Russia will fill the vacuum. And Norway has backed that argument with action. Joint exercises with the United States in Arctic conditions have intensified. American B-52 bombers have conducted flights near Norwegian airspace. American and Norwegian naval vessels operate jointly in the Norwegian Sea with increasing regularity. And the Nordic defense cooperation that existed in theory for years has been formalized into something that looks increasingly like an integrated Northern Command. Norway is not just participating in this network, it is one of its primary architects. In late 2024 and into 2025, Norway did something that generated genuine surprise, even among close allies. It announced plans to significantly expand military infrastructure in its northernmost regions, Finnmark and Troms, the counties that border Russia and sit within striking distance of the Kola Peninsula. New radar installations, expanded airfield capacity, pre-positioned equipment and ammunition, upgraded road infrastructure capable of supporting heavy military vehicles, investment in communication systems designed to operate in the electromagnetic environment that modern warfare creates, where jamming and interference are constant features, not occasional disruptions. This is deliberate signal sending of a very specific kind. When a country upgrades military infrastructure right on the border with a nuclear-armed adversary, it is not being subtle. It is communicating in the clearest possible terms that it intends to be present, capable, and not intimidated. Russia's reaction was predictable. Official statements criticized Norwegian militarization. Russian aircraft began probing Norwegian airspace more regularly, a pattern of testing that NATO allies are well familiar with, and that Norwegian fighter jets, soon to be F-35s, as Oslo also committed to the stealth fighter, routinely intercept. But here's what the Russian statements missed, or chose not to acknowledge. Norway isn't building offensive capacity on its northern border. It's building the ability to see what happens in its own neighborhood and respond to it. That distinction matters to Oslo, even if Moscow doesn't accept it. What makes Norway's recent moves genuinely surprising to outside observers isn't any single decision. It's the coherence, defense investment, energy strategy, Arctic infrastructure, Ukraine support, submarine procurement, maritime patrol operations, Nordic cooperation. All of these things fit together into a single strategic logic, and that logic has been remarkably consistent across different Norwegian governments over the past decade. That kind of continuity is rarer than it sounds. In most democracies, defense policy lurches between governments. Spending commitments get reversed. Equipment programs get canceled. Alliance relationships fluctuate with electoral cycles. The long-term investments that actually change a country's strategic position require years to materialize, and they only happen when there is genuine political consensus about the direction. Norway has that consensus. There is no major Norwegian political party arguing for neutrality, for reduced NATO commitment, or for a soft response to Russian aggression. The national conversation about security is serious, historically informed, and largely unified around a clear understanding of what Norway's geography means and what it demands. This is partly the legacy of history. Norway was occupied during the Second World War. That experience did not fade. It was absorbed into the national identity in a way that has shaped Norwegian attitudes toward defense and alliance membership ever since. And it is partly the legacy of geography. When you share a border with Russia, when the lights of Murmansk are visible on a clear night from Norwegian territory, the abstract language of geopolitics becomes very concrete, very fast. Step back and look at the full picture. Sweden and Finland joined NATO. The Baltic states have massively expanded their militaries. Poland is building one of Europe's largest ground forces. Denmark is extending its reach from the Baltic to the Arctic through Greenland. And Norway, sitting at the hinge point between the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean, right next to the Kola Peninsula, controlling the energy supply that keeps European economies running, is accelerating every dimension of its strategic capacity simultaneously. What you are watching in real time is the construction of a northern defense architecture that didn't exist 5 years ago, and that fundamentally changes the risk calculus for any adversary considering military action in this part of the world. Russia's northern fleet, which for decades operated with relative freedom in its own maritime backyard, now faces a much more complex environment. More sensors, more submarines, more aircraft, more allies sharing targeting data, more infrastructure built to support rapid reinforcement, and an energy relationship between Norway and the rest of Europe that means any Russian attempt at coercion in the high north would immediately collide with the interests of every major European economy. That's not a small shift. That's a fundamental restructuring of the strategic landscape. And Norway, 5.5 million people, a country most of the world still thinks of as a peaceful place full of fjords and the occasional Viking museum, is at the center of it. There's a particular kind of strategic power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hold press conferences. It doesn't make speeches about projecting strength. It doesn't need to, because the strength is real, it's built, and everyone who matters already knows it's there. Norway has been building that kind of power for years, quietly, methodically, with the patience of a country that has lived next to difficult geography for 1,000 years and learned to think in decades rather than news cycles. What changed recently isn't the direction, it's the speed, the acceleration of everything that was already in motion. The public announcement of a strategic intent that had been there all along, but that Oslo is now prepared to state clearly. Russia has a problem in the high north. It didn't emerge suddenly. It was constructed, piece by piece, across years of consistent Norwegian decision-making. And what looks from the outside like a sudden shock, a small country reshaping the strategic map, is actually something much more deliberate. Norway didn't just happen to be in the right place at the right time. Norway prepared for this moment, and the world is only now beginning to understand what that preparation looks like.